Our reading this morning is from Genesis chapter 7. The Lord said to Noah, "Go into the ark with your whole household, because among this generation I have seen that you are a moral man. From every clean animal take 7 pairs, a male and his mate, and from every unclean animal take 1 pair, a male and his mate. And from the birds in the air as well, take 7 pairs, male and female, so that their offspring will survive throughout the earth. In 7 days from now, I will send rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. I will wipe off from the fertile land every living thing that I have made." So the flood remained on the earth for 40 days. The waters rose, lifted the ark, and it rode high above the earth. The waters rose and spread out over the earth. The ark floated on the surface of the waters, and the waters rose even higher over the earth. They covered all of the highest mountains under the sky. The waters rose 23 feet high, covering the mountains. Every creature took its last breath. The things crawling on the ground, birds, livestock, wild animals, everything swarming on the ground, and every human being. Everything on dry land with life's breath in its nostrils died. God wiped away every living thing that was on the fertile land, from human beings to livestock to crawling things to birds in the sky. They were wiped off the earth. Only Noah and those with him in the ark were left, and the waters rose over the earth for 150 days.
Back in 1977, I became Noah, sort of. At the age of 15, I was babysitting for my principal's 2 kids that were very young, and the reason that they were with me and my parents was because my principal, his wife, and many other teachers in the area were busy at the school that night. You see, rain was coming down very hard. And television and radio reports, yes, we really relied on our radios back then. All the reports were predicting record rainfalls and an unprecedented flooding in our small city, tucked between the mountains with the Horseshoe River surrounding us. And like tornadoes, small towns in eastern Kentucky don't suffer natural disasters very often, but when we do, they are doozies. Which is why our friends are in Syersville still trying to recover from that tornado. So after my mom helped me put the kids to bed, I continued to listen to the weather reports. My mom and dad were on continuous calls with our neighbors, all trying to discern what precautions to take without overreacting. And we had an older neighbor, Hooker Phillips. He lived at the back of our neighborhood right by the river, not one to overreact. He relayed to folks that he had lived there the longest and the river had never left its banks in our area. "Sit tight," he said. "We'll be okay." To be safe, Mom and Dad, along with our other neighbors, began to move our vehicles to higher ground. Higher as in up in the mountain hollers, which were across the railroad tracks that ran parallel to our house. I think my dad even allowed me to drive a vehicle that night, which was pretty cool since I was still over a year away from legal driving age. So with our vehicles in a safe place and with the kids tucked in, my parents continued to listen to the news and walk the neighborhood to check the strategically placed measuring sticks to keep track of the pace of the river's rise. It was sometime later in that evening when I became Noah, sort of. I was very proud of my softball and basketball trophies. And I was pretty attached to the stereo system that my mom had allowed me to order with her S&H green stamps. So I began to move my trophies and my stereo and my records up to the attic. And then I thought, I don't really like wet clothes. So I'm going to take my dresser drawers up in the attic. After a few trips, Mom said, "Marsh, you are making a big mess." And I replied, "Well, if it doesn't flood, I'll just bring everything back down. And if it does flood, I'll be the only one here with dry clothes." She raised her eyebrow and just let me continue my moving. Now, a couple of hours later, it looked like the forecasters this time were right. We were going to get flooded. By this time, my principal and his wife were stranded across the river away from their young children, and they couldn't get to us. So we put everything we could up high. We packed a very small quantity of food because the river was literally running down the field towards us. We woke the small kids, and we headed to the holler in our remaining car. We were there about 2 days, watching the water rise, rationing our potato chips. And once the rain stopped, we walked along the mountain ridge to see our house, emerged in over 3 feet of water. Even our boat had sunk, thanks to someone leaving the plug out of it. Thank goodness that wasn't me. Finally, one of my brothers came to rescue us in a small fishing boat, and the kids were reunited with their parents, and we were taken in by my Aunt Alice. As the waters recessed, everyone was allowed to return to their homes, or at least what used to be their homes, the shell of what once was. Our little town in Pikeville was devastated. I've heard this story in Genesis so many, many times. As a child, I listened with wonder as I imagined all those animals in one big boat. Now, we had this cool little thing in Sunday school with a wooden ark and lots of animals and a few sets of people. Noah, his wife, their sons, their wives, but no kids. I remember thinking once, well, that's sort of sad. Kids would have really loved this enclosed zoo. And then as I continued to grow in my faith, I heard this story of Noah relayed in a different way. That because he was the only good man, God spared him and his immediate family. But that God decided to wipe out the rest of the world because it had become too wicked and too bad. I got to tell you, as a teenager, that interpretation scared the hell out of me. Literally, I guess. Because, honestly, I remembered it when I was tempted to do something I shouldn't. As a young adult, I didn't pay a lot of attention to the story. I didn't. I was too busy paying attention to myself. But sometime, I guess it was around my mid-30s, I started not to like this story too much. It made God seem uncaring and unloving. It made God appear punitive and ready to strike us when we made a mistake. It made God appear distant and very judgmental, and I wasn't scared. I was at best very disappointed. And at worst, intent on not wanting anything to do with that kind of God. But thankfully, I stayed on the journey. Admittedly, a bit hit and miss for several years, but eventually I began to really study this scripture. And I began to think of that flood in 1977, and I thought, well, Noah was like me. He listened to God's warning. And so he took his wife and his boys and their wives and some animals at God's direction, and he found safety. And when the waters recessed, he and his family emerged from the boat dry, and I bet smelly. They had escaped the drowning waters. I emerged from the 1977 flood with basketball and softball trophies intact and with plenty of dry clothes because I had listened to the forecasters. I remembered, though, even as I prepared for this week's sermon and reread this story, I remembered that other than having dry clothes, I was in the same boat with the rest of my family and the larger community in Pikeville. We had all lost our material goods, our furniture, our dishes, our food, our appliances. We had all lost valuable records such as wills and deeds and promissory notes. Some folks were honest and remembered them, some did not. The church had lost its hymnals and its Bibles and its instruments. And in my dry clothes, I walked in the house with my mom, and I saw something I rarely saw in my mom. She wept. She sobbed. It wasn't because her favorite outfit was full of flood mud or her favorite cooking dish had been broken. She cried when she saw the muddy, soaked pictures of when my brother and I were babies. She cried when she saw the drenched photographs of her parents who had long since been deceased. Yeah, I had a lot of dry clothes and some shiny trophies, but I was in the same boat. A flood mud-filled house and soaked memories. So to be honest, I didn't feel any better in my dry clothes than anyone else. In fact, maybe I felt worse. Because maybe I should have been putting the pictures in the attic instead of the trophies that I recently donated to Goodwill. It makes me wonder, how did Noah feel when God asked him to close the ark door before his friends could join the embarkation? I wonder, how did he feel when he opened the door once the rain stopped and saw that everything and everyone was gone? It was then that I began to believe and really hope that these stories in Genesis are not literal. They are indeed stories to teach us valuable lessons. Because I don't know about you this morning, but it would be quite troubling to me to believe that God demolished an entire world. It would make me watch over my shoulder to see what was coming next. You see, if I believe this literally, then I buy into folks on television who give God credit when their house is spared as a tornado wipes out an entire neighborhood around them. If I believe this literally, then I buy into folks who give God credit when children are healed from terrible disease or rescued from horrific circumstances. And it's tempting to do that. It is tempting to give God blame for the flood in Noah's day or God credit for the untouched house in ours. It is tempting to give God credit for the healed or rescued child, but there's a danger, church. And the danger is, I believe, that we begin to think that the boats we live in are different. That God blesses some and curses others. And that God chooses to spare one home or life and lets another go. And that is troubling, or at least it is to me. So I wonder if this story of the flood in Genesis, a story found in many, many more ancient texts, including the Quran, I wonder if the intent of this story is to teach us that we're called to listen to God and to be an ark. To be an ark of refuge instead of one of destruction. Things had gone awry in the ancient world, and they did over and over again. Things are still awry in our world. Perhaps we're called to be a church boat that lets anyone who finds their way to our door in, even if they don't exactly fit into the box that we have created. Those who find refuge in our churches and spiritual communities find their way to us, perhaps by God's direction. Perhaps they just find themselves sitting in our pew, and they're not sure why. You know, the animals somehow found their way on their own to the ark. Church, our church, any church, is meant to be a safe place for all different kinds of people. And we don't get to choose who's here with us. That is the beauty and the challenge of it. We are all in the boat together. And we are all called to sustain life and love. I don't know how Noah felt when he disembarked. But I know how I felt, standing in rubble with my dry clothes on. I dug right in with the rest of my family. And within minutes, no one could tell who started out clean and dry and who started out wet and dirty. We were all in the same boat, trying to dig ourselves out, recover how we could, clean the mud off our memories so we could emerge together in a new reality. Water in Scripture is used to depict both chaos and cleansing. And we live in between that tension from the time we move from womb to world. Brothers and sisters, we're in the same boat together, like it or not. And we're called to give and receive the waters of love and hope and grace. Noah did listen to God, and let's give him credit for that. And Noah did follow God's call to restore and renew the world. And let's give thanks for that. With God's help. With God's help, may we live in boats in smelly, wet clothes together, changing our lives and that of the world. I became Noah one day. Sort of.